Hello, and welcome to 6033 discussion on figures. This time we're looking at GFS, or the Google File System paper. And we're going to start with the system overview, which is in figure 1, the GFS architecture. And we've looked at this previously in class, but I just wanted to highlight some of the core points from this figure. Here we have a set between the application and the GF master and the GF chunk servers. Just a reminder that there is a legend included, which looks at the data messages and the control messages. As we discussed in class, they do this nice job of making the chunk data thicker in order to be able to illustrate that there is a larger amount of data that is flowing through these channels than the exchanges at the other areas. One of the things that GFS does a particularly good job of is using some icons that are recognized within the field for both the file tree structure, for the tables, and for the individual servers themselves. So we see a lot of standardization of the iconography here, and it is pretty thick with the labeling. It's probably a little bit more thick with labeling than what would be ideal, but it does a lot of work here in being able to explain what all of the parts of the system are, where the system iterates throughout in order to show that there are multiple options, while continuing the circular flow of how the process works throughout. So once again, we've got a couple of levels of abstractions. So we have the modules outlined here, and within the modules, we get a little bit of an insight into what's occurring within the individual modules. So within the master, we get a little bit of an understanding of the tree structure and the table structure. There's a lot going on here. The possibility for your own diagrams is maybe it would be nice to be able to break this out a little bit. Maybe there needs to be a separate diagram for the master. We can just get an idea of what some of the messaging it looks like in combination with the individual modules. And then maybe later in the paper, we break this out in order to take a deeper dive. But when pressed for space, this is certainly a viable way of being able to illustrate all of these points. But as far as the figure itself, we really want to call attention once again to the language that's occurring within the field of this unified iconography, making sure that messages are labeled and it's clear what messages are existing here. Possibly one option, rather than all this thick labeling, is to have changed the arrows, to have gone with some dotted arrows or some space dotted arrows to change the configuration of the arrows, and to have expanded the legend so you can make a better use of more iconography with the arrows in order to pull the labeling outside of the figure a little bit, and that may have cleaned things up somewhat. But once again, on this figure, one of the things that I want to go ahead and call attention to is the introduction of the figure in 2.3 under architecture. We've got the introduction of the figure at the beginning of this section with some nice active language. A GFS cluster consists of a single master and multiple chunk servers and is accessed by multiple clients as shown in figure 1. So once again, the purpose of figure 1 is to show the action that the system is utilizing. So we've got this active construction that demonstrates what the purpose of the system is and makes it very clear that there is a single overall message that you want to receive from figure 1. And then this section goes into the detail of defining these elements and walking us through the relationship to one another. And this is the same thing that's being attempted here within the figure, is to define these elements and demonstrate the relationship to one another. So the text and the diagram are attempting to do the same thing using a little bit different discourse from one another. They're not intended to do this individually. The goal is to be able to use this textual description hand in hand with the visual language that is being applied within the figure, so that the two create an understanding of the system that may be difficult to grasp individually. So you might not be able to understand how GFS works from the diagram, and it actually could be pretty hard to picture from just the textual description as well. Ideally, moving back, sort of oscillating between the text and the visualization, enhances the opportunity to have that kind of aha moment where you begin to understand the relationship to one another. And this does it a little bit differently. If you've watched the MapReduce video, certainly GFS takes a different approach, particularly within the text. GFS is more dedicated to defining elements here as they're walking through them rather than doing a process specific description. So where MapReduce was very process oriented when it engaged with a figure, GFS is more definitional. It's more taking us through what the elements of the modules are and then explaining how they work. MapReduce pulled those definitions out and really worked on doing the definitions earlier so that it could focus on process. Here, under the architectural layout of GFF, it's a little bit more focused on what the definitional elements are, and process sort of takes a little bit of a back seat. But process is more central here within the figure itself. And so this gives you some options to think about when it comes to how your text is going to relate in the system overview. You could go with a more definitional approach that uses the relationship sort of as definitions, or you could go with the more process-oriented version that MapReduce does. So there's a few different options, but the core here is to make certain that the elements you're using within the figure and the elements you're using within the text have a reciprocal relationship. They don't mirror one another, but they do work hand in hand in order to inform the reader of a more complete picture of what the system looks like.